Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Joaquin Mendez. I proudly represent the city of Chicago along with police officers Edward Wallman and Morris Levy. Today is one of two very important times where I get to talk to you directly about this case, and I'm going to do my best to tell you what happened to them on the early morning hours of December 7th, 1996. Why we're here and why you have such an important task. My opening statement is comprised of three segments. My introduction, an overview of what the case is about, and a preview of the most relevant facts and details. After that, I'm going to tell you how we're going to prove those facts and details to you before making any concluding remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case of cover-up, as my colleague asserted. This is a case of two police officers on duty who acted upon their solemn vow to protect one another, to look out for one another, and to be sure that they go home at the end of the day. That they go home at the end of the day to their loved ones, to their family, and to their friends. I'm not going to tell you what the evidence is just yet. As mentioned, the witnesses and the exhibits that are going to be presented by the opposing counsel and I will do just that. Nor is the purpose of me standing before you a chance to imprint on your mind every single important fact. If I do that, I would be here for a very long time. No, my statement is more like getting ready for a trip that you've never taken before. It's a Thomas Guide view of what will be presented. It's time to get oriented to certain signs on the road, certain landmarks, so that eventually as we take the trip, we understand where we're going, where we're headed, where we've been. My purpose here today is to give you a preview of what the city of Chicago and officers Wallman and Levy expect the case presentation is going to show. That being said, if you don't remember anything else I'm going to say in the next few minutes, I ask you to please remember this. In the heat of battle, split-second decisions have to be made, and nowhere is that more evident and more important than in police work. When such a split-second decision has to be made, and that involves saving the life of your partner officer by stopping a threat, there's little time for contemplation. In view of the circumstances, from the shoes of Officer Wallman, he had no choice but to meet a deadly threat against his partner with a deadly defense. And the force he used was reasonable. You've just heard someone else make a bunch of claims here to the contrary and about Officer Wallman and Levy, as though those claims were the gospel truth. What was said is nothing more than a claim of what they expect their evidence to show. Quickly, I can address the claim that was made earlier that Officer Wallman used excessive force to stop the threat. Charges or accusations are not fact, and keep this in mind as we proceed here. They're simply a claim of what they expect their evidence to support. Now, I intend no rudeness when I say don't believe a word of it until you've heard all of the evidence. You won't know what the facts are until you've heard all of the evidence, and this is why your presence here and your attention in this case is so very important. In this case, as in every case where the plaintiff is alleging that the police did something wrong, the plaintiffs present their case first, and that's why they were first to address you. It's because they have the burden of trying to support their position in their case by preponderance of the evidence. We're going to be cross-examining their witnesses that are presented by them to challenge that particular evidence. I can identify with having the responsibility for the protection of a fellow officer. And I consider myself still being in law enforcement. Yes, that's right. But as a lawyer, I enforce what are the most important laws of all, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The plaintiffs must prove, first and foremost, by a preponderance of the evidence, that a constitutional right was violated by the officers on the night that they encountered the enraged and drunken defendant and took action that the plaintiffs claim was unreasonable. In their endeavor, I'm the plaintiff's adversary. I stand in their way. I'm their opponent, the thorn on their side, if you will. Like any good lawyer, I'm a client's champion, and I'd like to give you a first blush of what our evidence will show. Quite simply, ladies and gentlemen, our evidence will show that this is a case about a person who had been drinking, then irresponsibly gets behind the wheel of his car and drives. During his trip home, he was bothered and angered by Officers Wallman and Levy, who were in plain clothes and were performing their law enforcement duties as they were driving slowly in search of a burglary suspect. Officer Levy stopped his car to allow this person to pass by, but instead of passing, he stops, he gets out of his car, and he attacks Officer Levy with a knife. Fearing for the life of his partner, Officer Wallman, with no time to exhaust his force options, was left with no choice but to stop the threat by using his firearm. How are we going to prove to you that the force used by Officer Wallman was reasonable when we can't go back in time and walk a mile in that man's shoes? We're going to painstakingly, as best we could, have you see things from his perspective that night, from his presence of mind, his fears and his concerns. And you will see that Wallman had no choice but to resort to that level of force. He was left with no options. And our evidence will show that. Attending the funeral of a brother law enforcement officer is a pain that I wish on no one. And it's a pain that Officer Wallman was duty-bound to prevent. So this is the city of Chicago and Officers Wallman and Levy's promise to you of what we confidently believe and expect that our evidence will show. This is our promise to you. I ask you, please keep an open mind until you've heard all of the testimony and scrutinized all of the evidence. Sometimes the very last thing that you hear is the most important in a case. Sometimes it's what you hear near the end that is the solution to it. I've told you what we believe the evidence will be. I'm not, by doing this, going to assume a burden that the city doesn't have. No, members of the jury, the plaintiffs have that burden of supporting their particular claim. And when this case is all over, I am confident that I will stand before you a second time to point out the ways in which the plaintiffs have not carried out that burden. Thank you very much for your attentiveness.
Is that all?